The show had to be spectacular. In Cairo, on the evening of April 3, 2021, the Egyptians pay a vibrant homage to the pharaohs who built one of the greatest civilizations in humanity. The mummies of 18 kings and 4 queens are being transferred to their brand new setting, the Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Among these mummies, the most awaited, the Pharaoh of Pharaohs, Ramses II, hailed as a head of state. Ramesses, a name that would have remained forgotten if it hadn't been for the genius of a man, a Frenchman, Jean-François Champollion. In 1822, this man from Grenoble, France, goes down in history by unraveling the great mystery of hieroglyphics. He succeeds in this feat thanks mainly to this cartouche he decrypts as Ramses, meaning begotten by Ra, the sun god, designating the great Ramses II. 6 years later, in 1828, Champollion fulfills his lifelong dream to tread on the soil of Egypt, and he writes,
I kissed the Egyptian soil, touching it for the first time, after having so long desired it. I am filled with confidence in the results of our journey. I will spare no effort to succeed.
Throughout his expedition that will last 18 months, from Alexandria to the temple of Abu Simbel, the fate of the greatest Egyptologist will constantly cross paths with the most illustrious pharaohs of ancient Egypt. With Ramses II, Champollion indeed discovers the pharaoh of abundance. A 70-year reign. 11 wives, 200 concubines. A pharaoh, warlord, and builder, who 1,000 years after the pyramids, crossed the country with temples of incredible beauty. A sovereign who even in death explodes. He dies at the age of 91, which is totally unheard of at the time. "200 years after the decrypting of hieroglyphics, a new feat is about to be undertaken. Thanks to the pharaoh's mummy, a team of Egyptian doctors and English forensic specialists will try to reconstruct his face from the past. Soon, they will be able to plunge their eyes into those of the mythical pharaoh and continue the great Egyptian adventure initiated by Jean-François Champollion.
I think Champollion would have been delighted to see the face of Ramses II. He was such an important and significant character that the idea of being able to see what he looked like would have been like the perfect end to his story.
On December 26, 1828, Champollion docks at Abu Simbel in ancient Nubia in the south of Egypt. That is where the most remarkable encounter will take place between the discoverer of hieroglyphics and the great pharaoh. A veritable shock for Champollion.
Abu Simbel alone is worth the trip to Nubia. It's a marvel, a setting worthy of admiration.
At Abu Simbel, Champollion discovers a first facet of Ramses II, a builder king who left an exceptional heritage to posterity. This masterpiece still fascinates archaeologists worldwide today.
This temple is magnificent. There's something majestic about it. It's a marvel. You can look at photos of it, but you really need to come here to admire the dimensions, the hugeness of this temple. And just imagine, when Champollion arrived in 1828, a sand flow coming from the plateau prevented him from getting into the temple easily. Champollion managed. He paid some workers to clear the top of the entrance door and slipped inside. It was a real furnace, more than 40 degrees, so he complained about the heat, but it so pleased him about what he discovers inside that tiredness doesn't get to him, and he spends several days inside copying out the texts.
A constant and abundant stream of sweat running down his body and eyes drips onto the paper that is already soaked by the humid heat of this atmosphere, overheated like an autoclave.
What makes Abu Simbel so particular can be found mainly in its building technique. Because this temple is a speos, in other words, a building dug directly in the mountain.
Imagine that you have a mountain here, and that with patience and strikes of the pickaxe, all the stones were cleared to leave only the useful things, namely the walls and the pillars to support the ceiling. But no blocks of stone were brought here. Everything you see was obtained by rock extraction to clear the spaces, and then the pillars and statues were worked on to obtain the shape they have today.
So everything had to be excavated and aligned with no room for error. For the pharaoh had demanded that the naos of the temple, the most sacred part, be oriented so that the rising sun lit up its deified representation and the gods surrounding it. A phenomenon that was only supposed to take place twice a year, the day of his ascent to the throne and the day he was born. Champollion is amazed by this enormous space carved into the heart of the mountain. But what really surprises him is the study of the decor that Ramses II put so much care into.
I regret not having a genie's lamp to transport them to the middle of the Place Louis XV in order to convince in one go the critics of Egyptian art.
Egyptologist and art historian Hurig Suruzian regularly comes to document this temple, the most accomplished, according to her, of the reign of Ramses II. There's a dynamic here, as much in the royal representations, which are full of dignity, strength, and power, as in the movements and bas-reliefs. Everything is in movement. Everything is very lively. I think it's magnificent. And here, there's a momentum. The galloping horses are jumping. It's extraordinary. It's a temple where the builder king was still very young, full of energy and dynamic, and we can see that transposed in the reliefs that are so full of life. It's fabulous. For Champollion, Egyptian art reaches a sort of peak here, and will not be equaled until centuries later with the Greek and Roman civilizations. The convention was to have characters portrayed in profile, as you can see in the bas-reliefs. They invented a form of representation that they really sublimated and repeated, it's true, but with variations and a pronounced taste for the aesthetic impact. So here the queen is represented standing. She advances, carrying her offerings to the goddess. Her elongated, almond-shaped eyes, surrounded by stripes of makeup, and her mouth and corners of her lips fleshy. That is typically Egyptian. We don't find that in other cultures. They were great artists, trained since their childhood and from generations before. And the care given to these representations is all the more important when it's a question of the pharaoh's image. Ramses II is going to order more statues and more colossi than any other pharaoh. More than 300 of these masterpieces still stand.
So you need some distance to admire these things.
Yes. It's such a rare opportunity with this light. I adore these statues. I love them because the sculpture is so well executed. In respecting the rules and conventions. But there is also the personality of the king himself in it too. The face is rather oval, the eyes slightly turned towards the inside. The bridge of the nose here is a bit thick, whereas in other portraits, his nose is a little hooked, which isn't the case here. But we recognize the mouth straight away with its shaped lips and the pierced ears. The ears are always pierced.
With your smile, we might think that you're almost in love with him.
No, if it was a question of falling in love, I think it would have been Amenhotep III, who was far more handsome. Ramses II also appeared to be deeply in love. In any case, that's what this site indicates. For Abu Simbel is in fact two temples. The first one is dedicated to Ramses, as well as to the god Amun. The second is erected in tribute to Nefertari, the pharaoh's favorite wife, and to the goddess Hathor. Only two queens have had this privilege in the entire history of ancient Egypt.
For a king to dedicate a whole temple to his wife, he must have truly loved her a lot.
On the facade of his temple, the queen is sculpted in the same proportions as the pharaoh. Here, Ramses makes Nefertari his equal, a sovereign and a goddess.
And these two temples allow us to understand how the world functions, according to the Egyptians. The world functions thanks to a main god, the sun god. The sun god is brought to creation, being inspired, it was said, by his wife, the goddess Hathor. And so the king and the queen, Ramses and Nefertari, embodied in a way the originating couple that enabled the creation of the world, the preservation of the world, and the development of ancient Egypt.
This encounter at Abu Simbel is the apotheosis of Champollion's journey. But this great Egyptian adventure began a few months earlier. On August 18, 1828, Champollion set foot for the first time in Egypt. And after exploring Cairo and Memphis, he begins his journey up the Nile. He adopts from then on the local style, with a long dark beard and Turkish turban. Feverish and excited, he has only one aim: to reach mythical Thebes.
It was on the morning of November 20th that the wind, tired of disturbing us for 2 whole days and closing the entrance of the sanctuary to us, allowed me to finally approach Thebes.
The Egyptologist goes first to the left bank of the Nile, where an immense monument is found, the Ramesseum. Here he discovers another personality trait of Ramses II, that of a great head of state. Christian Leblanc has been digging here for 30 years with the same enthusiasm as his illustrious predecessor.
It's always an immense joy seeing the sun light up this monument every morning. I must pay a justified tribute by saying that the Ramesseum is the noblest and purest thing in Thebes. Champollion arrived in this monument, seeing the name of Ramses engraved everywhere on the columns, pillars, and walls. He saw the monument of Ramses there, which became the Ramesseum.
In the mind of Champollion, this monument can indeed only be dedicated to a great pharaoh. In one of the courtyards, this colossus, in pieces, leaves no room for doubt.
It was a colossus that measured almost 18 meters high and weighed about 1,000 tons, that represented Ramses II seated and facing eastwards.
Christian Leblanc's team carried out the stone blocking and managed to put the colossus back together virtually. It is the biggest statue ever sculpted in ancient Egypt.
What's interesting to see is that here we find ourselves today in front of a block, a statue in stone, and that at the time, for the ancient Egyptians, this statue was alive. From the moment the colors were present, the image lived, the image was alive.
Champollion understands that this image was adored by the visitors who came to see it, just like a pharaoh is adored but also a god. Because the Ramesseum that Christian Leblanc's excavations allowed to reconstitute was at once an economic, administrative, and religious center. In the center of the building, there was a temple, richly decorated and dedicated to the worship of Ramesses. In the naos, there was a deified representation of the pharaoh in gold, placed on a sacred gondola for worship. But the Ramesseum was also an economic hub, bustling with multiple warehouses where merchandise transited before being redistributed. There were also kitchens, bakeries, breweries, and a whole administration that managed the ensemble.
What we have here is a prefiguration of the modern state. Egypt was going to live in a prosperous age. We have no trace during this era of the slightest revolt of the population towards the king. This will happen much later, however. So the reign of Ramses II is a very beautiful one.
By creating the foundations of an administered state, Ramses II reinforced the aura that made him go down in history. But half man, half god, the impact of his colossus on the spirits ended up creating fear.